What does it take to make workshops work? Many actually agree that one of the key skills of a facilitator is listening. And we hear buzzwords like active listening and deep listening. So I wanted to learn more about that. And I had a discussion with Oscar Trimboli, the deep listening expert, who joined me for this conversation from Australia. And since we could not stop talking, we recorded for over 90 minutes. So we decided to cut it in two. So welcome to the bonus episode of the Workshops Work podcast, a conversation with Oscar Trimboli about deep listening, the difference to active listening, and what it means for a facilitator or coach. So stay tuned. Hello, Oscar.
G'day, Myriam.
Welcome on board of the Workshops Work podcast.
I've been looking forward to listening to your questions all week.
And I'm looking forward to listen to your answers to your questions. You've been challenging me on social media already.
Well, I hope I'm challenging ideas and not you. I think it's an important distinction to think about. We hear a lot in workshops about, challenge these people. And what I always say is there's a big linguistic distinction between challenging the idea and challenging the person. So hopefully I've been challenging the thoughts you've been putting out on social media rather than just you.
Totally. And thank you for pointing this out. It's indeed an important difference. Yeah. And I never felt to be challenged as a person. I did like the food for thought. So please keep on doing that.
Excellent.
And today we're going to talk about the obvious, about deep listening and the relevance of listening in workshops as a facilitator, but also as a participant. And before we dive into that, I would be curious to know your story. How did you get from IT, I guess, into coaching, into listening?
I'll tell you 3 stories that kind of bring it all together. I grew up very close to a migrant centre where if you arrived in Sydney for the first time, you'd arrive at the Villawood Migrant Centre. And the school I went to, we had 23 nationalities, which meant we had fantastic lunches to swap. No boring sandwiches, all kinds of nationalities. And when I was going to school, there were wars happening in Asia, there were wars happening in South America, and there was undeclared wars, I guess, in Eastern Europe. There were a lot of people from Poland, from Yugoslavia fleeing to Australia. There were a lot of people from Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, and a lot of people from Argentina, Uruguay, and from Chile coming to Australia as well. And one of the things we did was play card games, and the card games we typically played was an Italian card game. And most people wouldn't know this, but I have this thing called dyscalculus, which means I can't count cards. I have a very poor relationship with numbers altogether. But what I was really good at doing was reading body language. So no matter what language the other team were playing in, their body language was giving away what was on their cards. And I can only speak one language, which is English. And I didn't really understand why everybody wanted me on their team, no matter what nationality they came from, because I could read the body language that people were giving away in their card games. It didn't take long for people to figure out what I was up to, and I was banned from playing cards, not because I counted the cards, but because I was listening to body language. Wind the clock forward to where you picked up the story about IT. I was challenged consistently by a lot of the leaders I worked with. Oscar, if you could code how you listen, you could change the world. And when you work at Microsoft, when somebody says to you, code that, and I remember Tracy saying this to me after a very tense negotiation between our global, regional and local officers around a budget negotiation. She asked me to stay back after the meeting. There were 11 people in our room from Microsoft on our side on this video conference. And when your vice president says, please stay behind after the meeting, you kind of think, how far ahead is my pay? Have I got 3 months, 6 months? How long could I last without a job? What's going to happen to my career? And Tracy sat me down and said, at the 22-minute mark, you realize you changed the complete perspective of the room, not just here, but in Seattle and Singapore. If you could code that, you could change the world. And I said to Tracy, do you mean code or code? And by code, I mean put it into software. And by code, it just means define it as a pattern or a method. And if anybody's had exposure to the technology industry, maybe they'll understand that. But I was challenged because I'd never really understood that my listening was a superpower. And in that moment, and honestly, Myriam, it was 30 seconds. I went, and then I forgot about it until 2 weeks later, where the chief financial officer, who was also the chief operating officer, we had the opposite conversation with our organisation in Australia. We had to take the budgets we were given and cascade those down to all the geographies around Australia. And again, I made a not too dissimilar observation in the first third of the meeting. And the observation I made was, because the meetings get really tense, particularly when you're trying to help people understand a new construct. And I simply said, what assumptions are we holding on to that might be false as it relates to this budget negotiation? And the kind of tension went out of the room. And Brian said to me after the meeting, the chief financial officer, he said, I need you to teach me how to do that. And I said, Brian, I have no idea what you're talking about. That thing you did again, you did it in the Redmond meeting. Now, how do I learn how to do that? And in that 3 weeks, I kind of went, oh, I don't know how to do that, and completely forgot about it again. And then somebody said to me, which was Brian's PA, hey, it's time for you and Brian to get together for your monthly one-on-one, but he wants you to teach him that listening thing so he can figure out what that meant. So it's not a lightning bolt moment, Myriam, where somebody kind of pointed it out or I noticed it. It's just been a peeling of an onion over decades to come down to this call, because I think what Tracy said and what Brian said and what others say to me is I listen to who people mean to be and what they're trying to say, not what they actually say, and it's my ability to listen beyond the words. So it was a mentor who challenged me, though, not too far back in the past, about 4 years ago, and said, what's your goal? How many listeners can you transform before you leave this planet? And I said to Matt, well, 1 million. And he goes, what, 1 million? And I said, yeah, that's a lot of people. He said, come back next month and tell me how you make it 10 million. So I come back next month and I figured out how to make it 10 million. And then he says, add a zero. I said, Matt, are we going to play this game every month? And he said something really potent to me. I remember these words for the rest of my life. If your goal can be achieved in your lifetime, it's not ambitious enough.
Wow.
So 100 million deep listeners, I don't know if I'm ever going to achieve it. But in posing that question to me, Matt changed my perspective and the way I think about teaching 100 million people how to listen. And how I go about doing that is completely different now. In the early days, I thought, well, these people I have to do face-to-face, one-on-one or in group trainings. But now I'm thinking about listening apps on phones, and I'm thinking about how I can work with other leadership coaches, facilitators, and trainers around the world about how they can help people listen to themselves to make a difference beyond words. Because most of us listen in black and white, yet we have the capability to listen in a wide range of technicolors. And that's my hope for the world, that they can learn to listen in the same range that they learn to see.
And there are a few questions coming up for me now. And one thought. So one thought is, and then I can put this aside, that maybe it's just about starting early. So to start with children in kindergarten and primary school on how to listen and what listen actually means. But this would maybe deviate. And the questions are, one, what is the difference between active listening and deep listening? And related to that, how many senses do we actually need to deeply listen?
I'm curious about the concept you dismissed about kindergarten.
We can come back to that.
Okay. For those of you who weren't watching, Miriam kind of turned her head to one side when she kind of put the kindergarten children to one side in the conversation. And if you're on a mobile device, it's very difficult to listen to somebody if you're not paying attention to what's going on their face. So the first question, what's the difference between active listening and deep listening? The active listening movement, really important, started in the 70s and the 80s, and its primary orientation is focus on the speaker and understand what the speaker means from a listener's perspective. So that makes a number of assumptions. The active listening movement talks about paraphrasing, for example, or non-verbal affirmations such as mm-hmm. And these are all very important things. I think active listening is foundational to deep listening. But active listening is focused on two levels of listening: listening for the content and listening for the context. Deep listening, we explore 5 levels of listening, and the starting point is not the speaker. Deep listening starts with listening to you. You can't listen to somebody else if you're having a conversation in your own head. If you have a dialogue going on right now about where you should be this evening, where you should be tomorrow morning, where you should be on the weekend, what's on your shopping list, what's on your travel schedule, you're in this dialogue. In fact, for a lot of you, it's happening right now. You're not even paying attention to what I'm saying. You're just in a dialogue with yourself. You see, Miriam, 86% of people struggle with listening because of themselves, their internal distractions and their external distractions. So to access the other levels of listening, listening for the unsaid and listening for meaning, you can't access those unless you have the foundation in place to be present in the conversation. It's very difficult to listen for what's unsaid when you're listening to the radio station playing in your own head that's tuned into a frequency about you. And that takes work, that takes effort. The active listening movement is important, it's foundational, but with deep listening, we want to move the orientation away from the listener making sense of what the speaker's saying. And the big distinction between active listening and deep listening helps the speaker make sense of what they're saying rather than the listener making sense of what the speaker's saying. That makes listening light, that makes listening easy, that makes listening potent, powerful, and creates an impact beyond words.
Very interesting. And this brings me back to the children, actually. Because while you were speaking, I was thinking it makes total sense with everything that we have in our mind, and especially now in our conversation. Me, of course, having in mind, okay, what could be a next question to ask, or what am I thinking while you're speaking? How can I connect? And to what extent will it be important or interesting to the audience? Because it's not only a conversation between you and me, but there's so many other people that I don't see who are listening. So it's, on the one hand, I thought that it takes a lot of self-confidence to deeply listen, because this means that I need to trust that I will come up with something to connect to what you just said without making a plan beforehand. And on the other hand, I thought maybe it's not self-confidence or maturity, maybe it's just presence, and then it would be a skill that's actually, I think, that children have instinctively and that we unlearn with age. So it would actually make sense to learn deep listening or to become aware of deep listening very early in age so that we don't unlearn it over time. Does it make sense?
Yes, I'm just reflecting on what you say. It goes back even further, Miriam. at 20 weeks inside your mother's womb, you can already distinguish the sound of your mother's voice from any other sound. And you're listening for your mother's voice. It's genetically coded in us. It's a survival instinct to ensure that we can survive once we're born. Yet at 32 weeks, we can distinguish Beethoven from Bon Jovi from Beaver. At 32 weeks, we already have the skill to listen and distinguish. So it's not about hearing, it's about the ability to distinguish, because a child in the womb will react differently to classical music from rock music, for example. So it's not that they're just hearing, they're actually making meaning of what that music is. Yet the very act of birth, and you talk about this unlearning, the very act of birth, the moment you are put down on a birth certificate as the day and time you were born, was the moment you screamed in the world. And we spend the rest of our life trying to be noticed by speaking. And we've all been trained in how to speak, yet none of us have been trained in how to listen. In fact, the statistics are really simple. 2% of us as adults are trained in how to listen, yet 47% of us are trained in how to listen. That makes sense to some degree, but if communication is speaking, 50%, and listening, 50%, you would hope that more of us would understand the syntax of listening, the palette of listening, the operators of listening, plus, minus, divide, subtract. We know that about maths, but what is that for listening? Because we don't have this construct. And that makes listening hard. It makes it easy for us to get distracted. And you're absolutely right. If we have the energy of natural naivety and curiosity, that's why deep listening is a very restful state. You don't have to anticipate the next question. You don't have to create pace and tempo in the dialogue. One of the things you can create is space through silence, for example. And a lot of workshop facilitators, for example, probably don't use that kind of space enough. And how much can silence do things for us? As David Rock would say, how do we let silence do the heavy lifting? So I think your proposition, your hypothesis around what can children teach us about listening is quite powerful. And yet at the end of our life, if we're relatively healthy, the last sense we lose is the sense of hearing. That's the last thing we do when we leave the planet. So hearing and listening is there before we're born, and it's there when we leave our consciousness and leave our bodies, whatever your spiritual or religious belief might be about that change of state in that moment. Because I've interviewed a number of doctors and palliative care nurses, and one of the things they say consistently is, despite the fact a parent or a grandparent or an auntie or an uncle may lose the capacity to speak, hearing is the last thing they do. And if you look at their eyes, they'll tell you very quickly. If you're arguing over the bed at the hospital about where they're at or what kind of treatment they should have, you need to ask the patient. And that becomes kind of full circle on your question. You need to use all your senses when it comes to listening. And when I say all your senses, that includes your gut feel and using all your sensing capability as a human, not just our ears, our eyes. You can feel, you can sense, and that will make a very big difference in the way you listen. But if you're bowing down and your head is focused on a mobile phone, it's impossible to use all those senses, because the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that's most used for listening, is engaged when you're on the phone. So although you're hearing, you're not actually listening.
I'm Rain. I'm from Experiential Learning. We facilitate programs for executives, and we use Session Lab because it's a very easy tool to design a meeting, easy to share with your colleagues, and get a script for the meeting in no time without too much hassle.
So visit sessionlab.com and find out more yourself. And you referred to body language before. So deep listening also means making sense of body language, of mimic, of visual clues.
Equally, state change, the energy a person displays in a moment. So it's not just what they show you with their smile or the wrinkle that might come to their cheek or their eyebrow going up or even their body position, whether their arms are folded or not. A human in tune with another human will notice their energetic state. And for a lot of us, again, we're not paying attention to that. At the moment, the state I'm observing from Myriam while I'm having this conversation is a state of curiosity. And the minute I mentioned state, she leant forward, her shoulders moved back, and she leaned in closer to the camera. So before that, she was leaning back a bit. She was much more relaxed. So the state change is what I noticed in that moment. But again, if your head's buried in a mobile phone, you're not going to notice that state of change. I'll use a practical story, though. I was working with a leader. This would be 2017, and they were dealing with a very complex organizational merger where they were merging with another organization. They were the acquiring entity, and they were trying to figure out a whole bunch of things. This was one-on-one. We're going to spend some of the time together today to talk about this in a group context as well. And he was in a dialogue with himself. Darren was telling me all the things that were going wrong with this merger. And I said, tell me more. What else? And just let him get as much out of his head as possible. And I simply asked him, what's it like for the people who have been acquired? Now, he's quite animated up until that point, but in that moment, he leant back, his eyes almost rolled back as he looked at the ceiling, and it only happened for about, at most, 2 seconds. And he started in dialogue again and got very animated. But that state change in that 2 seconds is something I came back when he'd finished. And I said, Darren, a few minutes ago when I posed that question, I noticed your head went back. I noticed your eyes went up. And I noticed your physical state change. Tell me more about that. And he moved out of a very rational description at that point and moved into a description about how they felt, rather than the feeling of all this story and language about a corporate that he was feeling in that moment. So all the conversation up until that time had been really, really rational. It was really dissecting, sequential, logical. And in that moment where he had to connect with how it felt to be them, his energy changed. And I said, let's go and play with that if you're okay. And he simply made the reflection, I've never thought what it's like to feel at work.
Wow. That's big.
So you can imagine the conversation took a completely different direction from that point on. It's in noticing state change. So that's their actual presence. Sometimes it's accompanied by a big sigh. They'll breathe out and they'll exhale very heavily. Or the opposite, they'll inhale and hold that for a moment. But again, if you're not paying attention, if your focus isn't on them and helping them make sense of it, Myriam, these moments are completely lost. And that's the power, that's the impact beyond words that you want to pay attention to.
So do you think that you came closer to find the code?
I don't think I'll ever find the code. I think what I've discovered is every hypothesis I've submitted to myself and to others has continued to progress, but code implies some level of binary. And I think there are some elements that can be coded. And I think there are some elements that are pure human chemistry, as I just described then. that in that moment of noticing a human with a human, that's difficult to code unless you've got a video camera on that person in that moment. So I don't make an assumption that this is my idea. I know it's an idea that's just coming through me, and that this idea has been transmitted over lots of people and lots of lives. I'm just happen to be the one who's catching it at the moment. So I'm really open to the possibility I could be completely wrong.
And I was asking because on the one hand, what you describe, that you find clues by paying attention of changes in posture, changes in breathing and energy, and this can be coded or put into a structure that is repeatable and thereby teachable. Whereas other things are purely instinct, intuition, superpower. So I think we do have an instinct that if our mimic, for instance, is not aligned with the words that we are saying, that we get this gut feeling that something is not kosher here. Yeah. So it's difficult to explain why we don't believe a person, and still very often we are right. So I think this is also part of deep listening, which is maybe not codable.
And yet Susan Constantine, who I interviewed in North America, otherwise known as the human lie detector, has been working with a lot of jury selection activity where she's trying to teach judges how to notice people who are actually telling the truth, because judges are so coded into believing that everybody's actually lying to them.
Awesome.
So it's the inverse of teaching body language and structures and all of this. And by far the most coding of anybody done at this level in terms of body language is done by Susan Constantine, as she has been working with a number of machine learning software companies where she's licensed this to other organizations using video cameras as well as audio cues in this regard as well. But ironically, she's been brought on board by police forces and judiciary to help them understand that this is what the truth looks like, as opposed to assuming everybody's lying to them.
What would be the first thing that someone has to learn to become a deep listener?
The first thing is it starts with you. So as much fun and as distracting as it might be to focus on Myriam right now, I need to be making sure I'm not being distracted, making sure right now that my focus is on you, not me. Making sure that I have enough empty space in my head where that can land. And when I notice something coming in that's distracting me in the moment, I just simply tap on the table next to me, and that's a place I put that idea and come back to it later. To do that, 3 things to start with you. Number 1, external distraction. Remove the cell phone. If you can't remove the cell phone, switch the cell phone into flight mode. If you can't put it into flight mode, put it into silent mode. And if you can't put it into silent mode, switch all the notifications off on all the apps. And I think I've given you enough range that anybody could pick from that, depending on the level of addiction you have to your device at the moment. The second thing is that a hydrated brain is a listening brain. The brain is only 5% of our body's mass, yet it consumes 26% of the blood sugars in processing things. So the fastest way to get blood sugars to the brain is make sure we're not dehydrated. If you love coffee, that's great. Drink as much coffee as you like, but for every cup of coffee you drink, you need to drink a glass of water and 1 extra. Wow. And if you're in a conversation with somebody else, offer them a glass of water as well. A lot of people say when they start to think about listening, their head hurts. What that really means is they're dehydrated. So for most of us, we go throughout the day in a state of dehydration. And we should be drinking between 1.5 and 3 litres of water a day, depending on the kind of activity we're undertaking. Yet most of us think hydration is how many cups of coffee we've had during the day. And we need to be careful of that. So tip number 1, remove the external distractions. Tip number 2, help your brain remove some of the internal distractions by giving it the blood sugars it needs. Drink water, be hydrated. And tip number 3, the deeper you breathe, the deeper you listen. If you keep in mind the following, and this is a ritual that I do before every customer meeting I go to, I enter the lobby of the building, I stand there, I switch my phone off, I put it in my bag, I go to the lift, I practice 3 deep breaths, which are simply in through your nose, down your throat, all the way through to the bottom, right down to your diaphragm and then back up again. We're not doing yoga poses in a lift, we're just connecting with our breathing. And if we do that, that will last approximately 15 seconds and your brain will be in a completely different state. Now, whilst I'm doing that, I'm posing the question to myself in that moment, is my intention on those I'm about to meet or myself? By the time I'm finished breathing, my intention has moved out. And then when I arrive, I usually get offered a refreshment. I always ask for water. And depending on how many participants are at the meeting, I always ask for water for them also. That's how difficult it is to integrate it into your practice. And if you're facilitating groups, the question I would ask you is, although there are jugs of water that are probably well below the temperature they need to be, are you instructing the group to drink water during the day, particularly after lunch? You will create a different state in the room if that room is hydrated. The mints in a meeting room for these facilitations, what are you trying to create there? Is that a default because you're going to a hotel room, or are you designing that? So think very carefully about the physical state you create for participants as it relates to curating a listening environment. I'm very deliberate at lunch, for example, to work with a venue to have as many low-carb options as possible and give the room a verbal cue. Hey, as you're going out to lunch, some of you may struggle to process the after-lunch session. If you avoid breads and pastas and rice out there, you're likely to get more out of the afternoon. But that's completely up to you, and I just make an invitation for them. But that's how conscious I am about creating a listening environment for everybody, both physically and mentally as well. And Myriam, they sound like really basic things, and yet as the owner of the space, the authority in the room when you're facilitating, how conscious are you to play to those simple things? To just before an exercise, I will often say, hey, you know, this exercise is going to stretch us also. Before we do, just grab a glass of water, and when you've got halfway through it, that means you're probably ready for this exercise.
Yeah.
So for those who aren't watching, Miriam's nodding, and I'm super curious what she's thinking right now.
I'm just processing what you're saying. And one is, yeah, it sounds simple, but most of the time it's the simplest things that we often forget because we take them for granted and then we don't write them down. We don't implement them into our routine. So it's even more important to make it part.
Yeah.
And then
it reminds me of a story of a Japanese company I was working with who'd read my book before I ran the workshop. And the Japanese country manager stood up to 80 people managers in the room and said, I've read Oscar's book. It's beautiful. I acknowledge that there is both Eastern wisdom and Western pragmatism in the book. I've read it for the last month every week. This book is simple, but its practice is difficult.
Yeah.
And like any practice, it's just the commitment to the ritual and the habits every day. And if you love a great book on habit formation, Atomic Habits by James Clear is a book I strongly recommend to everybody.
Yes.
It's all about micro change, really small micro change. It's not that you want to go to the gym. It says put your clothes and your shoes out before you go to bed. Get into that ritual first, and then you're more likely to go to the gym.
And make them so small, these habit changes, that you cannot not do it. And I can totally relate to that. I started once with daily exercise, and I started with 2 push-ups every day. Waking up, having a glass of water, 2 push-ups. And then over the course of 3 years, I ended up with 3 sets of 25. Wow. And that's just so deeply in my habits that I cannot not do it, because it's like leaving the house without brushing the teeth. So I'm a big fan of these small habits. Do you practice meditation or any form of mindfulness? Because
probably not the way you think I do.
So what is your assumption of what I think you do, and what is your practice?
I sense most people think meditation is something you need to have a place and a space to do it in, and a time. And for me, I'm a crazy kind of guy. I learned to swim as an adult, and I learned to swim in the ocean as an adult. So, especially in Australia, where there's no shortage of things that are going to eat you in the ocean. It was 2011 where somebody suggested I should learn how to meditate. And I went, yeah, okay, fine, no problem. What's this whole meditation about? And I went, okay, well, I'll learn the silent meditation, and I'll do the 10-day silent meditation. I'd never done anything in my life in meditation, yoga, any of that. And so I decided to check myself in to a 10-day silent retreat. And all I managed to do was really strain my hip muscles. And I always remember what the instructor said at the end: as you go out into the world, only a monk like me can meditate the way we have every single day. And for some of you, you will begin a practice where you will be able to meditate for an hour before you rise in the morning and start your routine. But for the rest of you, I give you permission to meditate at any moment during the day, whether that's eating breakfast, drinking a glass of water, eating lunch, eating dinner, walking in the park. You should integrate meditation into everything you do rather than meditation being something that you do. So for me, my meditation is noticing and being grateful for my toast in the morning. My meditation is I'm grateful that I can walk from meeting to meeting in a city that I'm in. So not the kind of person that would sit still before I went to bed or when I woke up in the morning and take time aside to empty my head. That's my assumption, what you meant by meditation. What about you?
I do these 10 days meditation retreats. I just came back from my 3rd Vipassana. So I do sit in silence. And I also believe that it's not only about that. So the benefit of meditation is not being able to sit in silence and to sit in discomfort, which is even more important than the silence. But it's to practice this muscle in order to be able to do what you just described.
Yeah.
So for me, doing the sitting is like going to the gym. So I'm training a muscle to, first of all, be able to sit in discomfort without reacting, to notice, oh, this feels uncomfortable and I don't need to react right now because it will pass. And the other is to clear the mind and to notice when being present or to be present with someone. So to be in this meditative state when the both of us are having this conversation. My name is Myriam Hadnes, and it is my mission to help you to make workshops work. Today with me on the show is Oscar Trimboli. And because we couldn't cut ourselves short in our conversation about deep listening and the impact of listening on workshop facilitation, that we cut our conversation in 2. So today you're going to listen to the impact of listening on facilitation and actually what it means to deeply listen, to not only the participants, but also to yourself and to the room. So stay tuned.
What do you think the audience who is listening right now would be wanting to ask us?
Maybe the obvious, given the title and the concept of the show, is how this relates to workshop facilitation, or how this relates to becoming a better facilitator, or how we can learn it. What do you think?
Where would you like to go?
I think I would like to explore the space of how listening makes us better facilitators, but maybe we already covered this. Because I think through the listening, we can read the room. Through deep listening, we can read the room better. We can understand the needs of the participants better.
I think we've touched on what listening means when things are said.
Mm-hmm.
In service of those listening, I think we need to explore how to listen to the room for what's unsaid.
I invite you to share your thoughts.
But you're my host, so mine's merely an invitation. Where would you like to go?
I would be curious to hear your thoughts about that now. How can we hear what's unsaid?
So the maths of listening is really important for all of us to understand. And if you have listened this far, thank you. And if you take only one thing away from this conversation, it's this. If you were to tell anybody that this podcast would be useful, it would be this part of the conversation. 3 numbers, 125, 400, 900. I speak at 125 words a minute, yet in my head, I have 900 words a minute that I can think of in any one time. As I mentioned earlier on, I have dyscalculia, so I'm not very good at maths, but someone who is told me that's at 11%. There's an 11% chance that what the person, the group, the table, or the room says is what they're thinking and meaning. There's an 11% chance that that's what they actually mean. And yet most of us would not go to a doctor who gave us an 11% chance of surviving a surgery and say, thanks, let's move on. Coming up on our agenda now is...
Love the example. Yeah.
Yeah. So we need to help the speaker understand what they mean, and none of us take the time to do it. Now, remember, I mentioned 400. I speak at 125 words a minute. You can listen to 400 words a minute, so you're programmed to be distracted. But we've already covered off how to get around those distractions, the cell phone, the water, the breathing. But I want to focus on exploring the unsaid. The unsaid is the ninja move of listening. We all facilitate in beautiful locations. They might be vineyards, they might be resorts, they might be somewhere near a river or an ocean. They're designed to get them out of their current state and into a different state. Myriam, in February this year, I was hosting an organization who was reviewing their middle of the year plan, and they were talking specifically about company values. And I was talking about it at this beautiful vineyard about an hour and a half outside of Sydney. It was quite historic. It had a golf course, it had beautiful fountains, it had ducks. We can all picture ourselves there. And it was a spectacular summer day in the Hunter Valley. Blue skies, amazing sunshine, and we were coming up to the morning tea break. And the group had gone through an exercise where they were talking about the barriers to having the values of the organizations fully expressed, not just by the leadership team, but by every employee in the organization. And at the break, as we do as facilitators, there's some work we need to do in the room. And then if we're lucky, we might have time to grab a refreshment or a restroom break. But I always make a point to walk around to these 15 leaders and just make a point for them to notice that I'm just paying attention to all their conversations. I come back into the room. I invite everybody to take their places. And I simply say this, given everything we've discussed this morning, I bet, in fact, no, not only do I bet, I've heard some things you haven't said in the room at the tea break. And then, as Dr. David Rock would say, I let silence do the heavy lifting. By the 30-second mark, I go, hey, I'm a professional at this. I can outweigh all your silences. And then a brave soul will speak up, and then the popcorn effect takes place. Now, if you were to talk to my host for this meeting, I'm completely off the agenda right now. This is not what the agenda says to do, but it is exactly what the group needs in that moment. And I'm cheeky because I continue to say no matter what they say. Now, honestly, Myriam, I'm not paying attention to anything they said in the tea break at all. All I keep saying is there were other things you guys were discussing besides this. And then someone will say that breakthrough moment and they will stand up and they will declare to the room, well, I didn't say this at the break, but this is what we need to discuss. And it's the moose, the elephant in the room, whatever metaphor you want to use, and you can see everybody nodding. And I think the courage and the conviction of a facilitator to hold that moment for the group, it's not for you, it's for them. And yet the biggest breakthroughs come in that moment where people notice what they haven't said because they're only giving the safe answers to begin with, whether it's on a sticky note or out loud. It's taking the group to a completely different state of consciousness, a different state of performance, and a different state of impact if they fully explore what they haven't said, either themselves or to each other. Because it's very, very, very important that the room listens to itself. And in a lot of cases, I make sure that I keep circling the room so they're not talking to me, and I keep gesturing to them to talk to each other. Now, Miriam's been nodding furiously throughout all of this story. The resolution to that story is a CEO of that group stood up and said, thank you for being so honest. He turned to me and said, I don't know why I felt so anxious you were off agenda for the last 15 minutes until the last 3, where we've heard things that are going to make a difference not just to us, but to all our employees, our customers, and our suppliers. Can you help us move forward? And then we just reset the agenda from there. The agenda always gets scrapped the minute you go and explore what's unsaid, because they move towards what they mean rather than what they want to project to the room.
I have different thoughts. One is, thank you for sharing first. It sounds to me as this unsaid is present in most of the meetings that matter. So in most of the meetings for which they would hire external facilitators. So to what extent do you actually really need this superpower of sensing that something has been unsaid, or just faking it? And because you can say or invite the group to say the unsaid, even if you haven't sensed anything.
Yeah, and that's why deep listening's so easy. You don't have to listen. You know, it's universal. If I speak at 125 words a minute, I got 900 words stuck in my head every minute. The likelihood that what I say is perfectly formed the first time I say it is an 11% chance.
Yeah.
Now, prep may help, but I've noticed that prep will move that to maybe 20%. It's the space you create for everybody to speak their truth rather than the truth they think the leader wants to hear is the skill. And Myriam, it's honestly not about faking it. It's about having your intention and attention on the group rather than yourself. If your attention is on yourself as a facilitator, you just continue with the agenda. You just deliver to that. And yet for all of us, we know some of the biggest breakthroughs come in the moments that we never planned for. It's the content that comes from the room, and the courage and the invitation I make to every facilitator out there is you are the expert in the process, not the room. They own content, but if they knew what to do, they would have done it without you.
Yeah.
Stand in your strength as a facilitator and you will make a huge difference.
And what does it take to create the space where you would also have this one courageous person to stand up and to speak out what everyone is thinking? Because this is, I think, the groundwork that you have to do, is to lead to this moment.
I'm not sure that the courageous person speaks the truth of the group. I think they speak their truth in that moment, and it just happens to be a collective truth, if that distinction makes sense. They're just saying what they feel. They're not trying to figure out what it means for the group as a whole. And so for you, you need to be role modeling consistently that your attention is on the group, that you're listening really intently, and you're exploring a range of opinions in the room. In that room was really conscious of the fact that I would not leave a topic till everybody had spoken. And people go, oh my God, that must take so much time. It doesn't take as much time as the cost of moving at a glacier-like pace after the workshop because all the opinions haven't been heard. So for me, when I take a brief from an organisation, I'm very clear to them that we can come up with whatever agenda we want, and that will make sense till the morning tea break. After that point, the group will take it to where it needs to be. And if you're not comfortable with that, don't hire me. Because most people will say, well, we've got a room full of managers and no leaders. It's because you're not creating the space for them to feel safe. To come into that room and lead, to have courageous opinions without fear of retribution. So one of the things I'm very deliberate with my host is I will always ask you the question last, not first. And your response will always be a reflection of the room, not your opinion. So I ask them to reflect back themes they've heard, not specific content. We don't want to call out Myriam's point about employee engagement. We want to talk to the theme of how did we discuss employee engagement. So I think the one hack, the one tip I'm very deliberate about is before the meeting, I don't interview anybody before the meeting at all. It's not my job. It's not important for me to hear what those people say. If my attention is about me, then I do a pre-brief. If my attention is on them, they speak to themselves in the room and they all hear the same thing at the same time. So the only briefing work I do is with the leader of the system to say to them, you will always be last and you will only reflect on the themes.
What are the reactions you get when you tell the leaders that?
Well, it's an invitation, so it's their choice. 20% of leaders go, thanks, we'll find another facilitator, which is great, no problem. There's enough work for me without that 20%, because I want to work in systems that want to make step changes, not incremental changes. I want to work with leaders that create an environment for their team to step up in the workshop and beyond. I want to create a sustainable container beyond the workshop without me being there. And a lot of them will struggle with it. They'll say, so what happens after morning tea? And I say, the group will decide, but this is the outcome. But maybe that's not what the group needs right now. But maybe it is. And maybe we can integrate that into the approach for the rest of the day. For a lot of leaders, it moves them from telling to listening, from telling to asking, from moving from directive to noticing. And for a lot of leaders, this is a new place and space, but they also relax. I always pull them out at the lunch break and go, how's the pace? How are we going? It's like, oh, this is amazing. Just keep going, Oscar. I'm enjoying this so much. Just watching the group step into its own voice. you've just taught me something from doing that alone. I've got what I need from the event. Now it's going to be amazing to see what happens in the afternoon. Now, is there conflicts in these groups, and do coalitions emerge during the day? You'd have to be a pretty naive facilitator to think that they wouldn't. But as long as you're conscious of that, you can work with that because you have the frameworks and the process and the skill as a facilitator. So don't be naive to say, oh, well, every workshop Oscar runs is just wonderful, magical unicorns and fairy tales. There are train smashers too, where coalitions emerge in the unsaid. And then I start to make a reflection on the noticing. I am noticing two coalitions are formed. Are you guys noticing that? Is this how it plays out in the workplace? Well, yeah. So is that productive? And off we go.
It is, at the end of the day, I think, the conflict you need in order to have breakthroughs. Because if everyone was aligned and you had this happy family unicorn atmosphere in your workshop room, they most probably wouldn't need you anyway.
And they don't make progress.
Exactly. I can imagine that there's this one moment where suddenly the energy in the room shifts, where people would understand that what listening means. So I wonder whether you facilitate this or whether it happens naturally just because you lead by example or you give space to several participants for speaking and listening, or whether you have maybe an exercise that would prime them into the listening.
I don't think there's this magical pin drop moment where people go, that's what listening is. If I just copy that, then I'll be fine. There's the formula for listening. Listening is a practice and listening is a strategy, and I'm far from a perfect listener, but every day I want to improve. One of the things and most common bits of feedback I get from the room is, we learn how to listen from the way you are listening to us. The techniques that you've applied, I'm not applying to my team. So one of the things I'll do consistently in the room is not invite somebody to speak by saying, Peter, I notice you haven't spoken. It's not. I will stroll up close to Peter and I'll just reach out my hand at a point where there's silence and just make a very simple gesture for Peter to speak. Half the time they'll accept the invitation, half the time they won't. Half the time I'll come up to them and I'll just whisper in their ear and I'll say, I'm sure this room's fascinated in what you're thinking right now. And the room won't notice I'm doing that because I'm doing it in a moment that is respectful for them as well as the person I'm saying that to. Mm-hmm. And the common piece of feedback that I get is the way you taught us to listen to what's unsaid is a technique that I can take back to my one-on-one meetings, to my team meetings, because the team meetings are really, and the one-on-one meetings are really the fabric of any organisation. If that's broken, so's the organisation. And if that's working, then so's the organisation. But all of them consistently come back to me and go, the way you use silence, Oscar, we're not doing that. The way you role model that, that was useful for us. Thank you. And I have listening exercises. I have jigsaw puzzles. I have playing cards. I have all sorts of techniques. But what's more useful to the group is their ability to listen to themselves in the context of the dialogue that they'll be using when they step out of the room. If I create an artificial construct for them around a jigsaw puzzle, which sometimes you need for a breakthrough, or how to notice what your listening villain is, what your listening blind spot is, that's useful. But if they can learn in context of their current dialogue, their learning is more sustained when they leave the room. Mm-hmm. We don't have to do butcher paper on the 5 levels of listening. They just go, okay, phone off, drink water,
inhale,
make sure I breathe. That's mostly what people take out. And if they get to listening for what's unsaid and listening for silence, that's all fantastic as well. But I think we underestimate the power we hold as a leader of a process when we're facilitating simply through our role modeling. The way you deal with conflict as a facilitator is role modeling to them. What does good conflict look like? What does productive conflict look like? Because for a lot of systems we operate in, the definition of conflict is how do we avoid that? And yet, just like gold is created in this space where lots of energy is expelled in the heat of the moment, where gold is formed under a crucible with lots of fire to create energy, every great idea is created in the space that's the tension in conflict. And for a lot of leaders, deep listening isn't avoiding conflict, but it's stimulating the ability for us to listen to views we haven't considered by exploring the unsaid. And in doing so, there is tension in the ideas. The tension doesn't always have to be tension that creates conflict. It can be just tension that creates a new perspective for ourselves as well. So I think, Myriam, don't underestimate the role you play as a facilitator in role modeling what the change should be for the room. Because a lot of the time when I talk about listening for what's unsaid, I always pick one of the big challenges they may be facing. I can think of one where we were at a mountain-based retreat about 1.5 years ago. Beautiful view over the mountains at the west of Sydney, about 250 kilometres. It was winter. It was a beautiful, brisk day, but it was very blue sky. And we're in this magnificent wooden heritage, about 100-year-old resort. And their problem was they weren't getting the kind of growth that they'd expected and got for the last 2 to 3 years. And I simply posed the question, what aren't we listening to when it comes to our customers? What are we not taking the time to hear from them? What are they leaving that's unsaid? And the group spent 45 minutes pretty much by themselves. And that's that facilitator moment of gold where you go, look at them go. They're exploring ideas fully. They might not be discovering solutions. There's tension in the ideas. And you don't need to stimulate that dialogue at all. And in those moments, I'm using sensing to know where the energy is. I don't use bells. I don't use buzzers. I let the own energy of the room decide when it's time to stop with that idea, because we all know the volume goes down when they've run out.
Yeah.
So if your attention is out, we don't need bells and chimes and buzzers and things, because that's about our agenda, not theirs. And if we're going with the flow and the human connection and the great ideas, sometimes the best ideas are blown up by a countdown timer.
I'm Rain. I'm from Experiential Learning. We facilitate programs for executives, and we use Session Lab because it's a very easy tool to design a meeting, easy to share with your colleagues, and get a script for the meeting in no time without too much hassle.
So visit sessionlab.com and find out more yourself. 2 questions. Would you break them into smaller groups to reflect on this question, or would you also leave it to the energy or to the instant moment, how they feel like processing the question?
That room that I was working with was about 25 people. So, I'm conscious that I've been taught by a couple of corporate anthropologists, the minute you move the group between 5 and 7, the coalitions will form. And the ideas won't either have the tension in them or people will take a position. But I invite the room. So what they did in that moment is, so I go, how would you like to explore this idea? And they went to a very traditional approach. They said, we're going to break into our customer segments, big customers, medium customers, and small customers, and we're going to go into a group to do that. I go, great. Is there another approach we haven't considered that might be useful here? And then somebody said, maybe we should go long-term customers, medium-term customers, and short-term customers. And then somebody else said, maybe we should think about it from who were we competing against in the time?
Mm-hmm.
And then I simply said, look, guys, you've got 3 different approaches. They're all completely valid. I'll leave that up to you to decide how you go. And they actually did a hybrid. They didn't do big, small, whatever. They kind of did a world cafe where they set up themselves in rotation, and they had one group that was based on customer size. They had one group based on customer tenure, and they had one group based on competitors. And people just moved across the groups in a very fluid way once they thought they couldn't contribute more to that group to the other group. And it was just beautiful to watch. But I think my role in the facilitation at that moment, Myriam, was to get them to get out of default and get into design and go, what approaches haven't we explored that might be useful? Now, it was interesting, the big ideas that they came up with, they all came from the different groups. They didn't come from one group only. So I thought of that as kind of a 3x3 matrix if we were putting it up on a PowerPoint slide, and they could fill all the 3x3 up. But originally, if I didn't just pose the question to them, what's another approach, they would have only got probably one great idea based on customer size, or one great idea based on competition, or one great idea based on the age of the customer. And I think it takes courage for the facilitator in that moment to go, it's okay to just go where the group's going.
Yeah. And to allow for variety and not taking a decision, okay, this is how we're going to go, but let's explore the different options and see what you're coming up with. To what extent do you actually still draft an agenda, especially the after lunch part, given that most of the time, as from what I hear, you're saying you drop it anyway?
Well, they draft their agenda for the day, and by the morning tea break, they've reset the agenda. It won't surprise you that after the lunch break, I ask them to revisit the agenda and what they want to achieve for the rest of the day. And in many cases, so for me, it's about role modeling what it would be like back in their system, back in the office, back in the government department, back in the non-for-profit, wherever they're working. My role isn't to give them frameworks to be rigid. My role is to go, how can you make this sustainably once I'm not here? So all of them should be continually looking to fine-tune. If you don't, what happens is you have this reorg from hell because you've left things for 3 years, and then that makes change really hard. Whereas if change is, again, back to James Clear's point, if change is just incremental and we're always checking in and testing and making little adjustments, it makes change a little bit easier for the organisation, but more importantly, the employees, the customers, the suppliers to consume. And I don't do that from a place of I know best. I do that from a place of what will help the group do this when I'm not here. Because I think the collective is always more powerful than me in my role as facilitator. So my role as facilitator is just to create the environment in which they can be their best self, speak what they mean as opposed to speaking their truth. I don't know what their truth is. That's up to them. I hope they speak what they mean. And then they can design what that means for the rest of the time together. I've had one organisation where at the end of the morning tea break, they rang a couple of employees in the office and said, we need you here this afternoon. We missed you and we didn't have you in the original attendees, but we've decided that it's important for you to be here. So it's not just the agenda that flexes. It could be the attendees.
Wow.
It could be the entire context of what this means. So don't think it's only how we look to create a container for time. It could be how do we create a container for the conversation and who's present. I saw that done completely differently with another organisation where they decided that they would ring a customer in the break and ask the customer if they would come in on a conference call in the afternoon just to test the idea that they were trying to develop during the day. So in that moment, this system was very internally orientated, and my challenge to them consistently, and I was pushing them hard, I'd say, so how can we test that idea? And they go, well, we could go to research and get a focus group, or we could go to insights and get the research. I said, how else could you test that idea? And eventually I just said, is there any other things we haven't considered? And it was the PA to the CEO who said, why don't we ask the customer? And I turned to her and said, which customer should we ask? And it was like I dropped a bombshell, because she was never considered as an opinion that was important. And she said, whatever the customer name was, but the point she made about the customer was, this customer is really struggling with some of the way our services work. And I heard at a PA lunch that I attended last week, they're thinking of leaving us. Now, her opinion would never have been heard.
Mm-hmm.
And guess what she did? She rang the person who was the EA, who was at that other EA meeting with her, and asked if it was possible if she could organise the chief financial officer as a favour to her to come in. Now, get this, not a single person in this room on this leadership team had ever met a CFO, had a relationship with a CFO, and the CFO spent 15 minutes elegantly saying what was wrong with their service.
Awesome.
And they saved a customer. So again, the agenda doesn't have to be the agenda. It just has to be what helps the group progress.
Yeah. If you could, and I would like to refer back to what you said, that the relevance is that the group takes or learns something that they can apply on a daily basis back in their business routine. So what would be your advice to a team leader or manager on how to practice this way of meeting in their daily business, in meetings?
If you're okay, I just want to come back to how they would practice it outside the room.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things I'm very conscious of is before the first break, I'm holding the room's energy. After the first break, I'm balancing the room's energy. After the next break, I'm reviving the group's energy, because normally they've been to lunch or something like that. And then finally, after the last break, how can this room sustain its own energy? My energy is almost invisible in the room. Yeah, so I'm working on this gradient. And if that's over multiple days, then I'm designing that as well. So one of the things in my agenda is, how the hell can I get out of their way? I want them to sustain themselves. And back to your question, I am knowing that it's a successful day of work, or 3 days of work for me, when people are starting to use frameworks and language that I've set them up with in the meeting itself. So they're already practicing in their own context. So one of the tips I would give for leaders who are doing that is, your role modeling is critical. If you're role modeling timeliness, as an example, start on time. So one of the things I always do, right at the beginning, imagine we're starting at 9 o'clock, Myriam, and everybody's actually in the room and present by 9:12, as an example. I will wait till the room's there, and I will hold this really uncomfortable silence. And I'll turn to the room and go, guys, if we divide 12 by 60, what's the answer to that question? And everybody's looking at me in a completely confused way. And whatever the answer is, 22%. Somebody will say 22, they'll say finance knows 22%. I say, okay, I want to speculate that either you're behind budget by 22%, your projects are behind schedule by 22%, but basically your system is underperforming by a quarter. Oh, how do you know that? I said, the way we do one thing is the way we do everything. How many of you turn up to internal meetings 12 minutes after the hour, 7 minutes after the hour, 5 minutes after the hour? You're role modeling to the group. It's okay to be late. So for people in organizations who are team leaders, please, 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 the shadow you cast as a leader with your role modeling has immense power. And if you're facilitating your own team meeting, everything you do in terms of including all opinions, coming prepared or being on time is already sending a signal to the group about what you value. As a guiding principle, by the end of the meeting, you should be speaking the least and the group should be speaking the most.
Mm-hmm.
Because if all the group's hearing when you're in a team meeting is your voice, you shouldn't have invited everybody else. Make sure you hear from everybody else's voice. That doesn't mean sequentially or in a popcorn format or anything like that, but just be deliberate in your design. How do I hear from all the voices in the room? How do I play back themes that you're hearing from the room rather than isolating individual content that would make someone else feel like it's not safe to speak up?
And I think reducing, as a team leader manager, reducing your own speaking time will also help you to objectively reflect on the success of the meeting, because there's this study that we tend to evaluate conversations better the more speaking time we had. So we tend to say, oh, this was an awesome evening if we spend most time speaking ourselves.
Yeah.
So
and think about this, Myriam, for the leader. If you're asking what-based questions rather than how-based questions, you're asking the wrong questions to hold the process for the team meeting. So what's an example of that? Every fourth meeting, if you're on a monthly cycle, you should be asking the team, how are these team meetings going and how should these team meetings go going forward? Because again, you're embedding constant improvement there, but many managers never ask that question. We do a work in progress, we go around the room, we get a report in from everybody and everybody's bored and disengaged. As opposed to, hey guys, how would we run this meeting to be more effective next time? Well, let's stop going around the room, boss. Let's have the meeting thematic each month about our 3 pillars of strategy. Great, no problem. Next 4-month cycle, how are our meetings going? They're going great, boss. The themes are working really well, but can we chair the meeting instead of you? Great, no problem. So somebody else chairs the meeting and somebody else hands over to the next person. Maybe they do it monthly, but they do it quarterly. You need to allocate 10% of any meeting time to be process time when it relates to team meetings. And not enough leaders do this, and they get stifled team meetings and they get unproductive meetings. And the easiest way to understand if they're stifled, people turn up late, people leave early, people aren't contributing. So the easiest way to unstick that is ask the unsaid. How's this meeting going? If they can't answer that, hey, what's the most productive thing about our meetings? Hey, what's the least productive thing about our meetings? And that'll stimulate dialogue. If there's no trust in the group, ask that one-on-one before the next meeting and you'll be shocked what you learn as a leader.
Yeah, it's actually a nice checkout. I like to do this as a checkout after a meeting or workshop. Just reflections on the meeting without interruption or side talking.
Yeah.
Is there anything that you would have wanted to share or touch upon in this conversation that we ignored?
That's a lovely role modeling of the unsaid question, listening at level 4. And I'd like to invite you to explore the question from the perspective of the audience. It would help me if you could frame the question that way.
What would you like the audience, which is mostly facilitators, but also team leaders who do facilitate workshops, what would you like them to take away from our conversation, or on top of our conversation? What is the message you want them to hear?
It would simply be this. As a facilitator, you're enough. And where we get knocked off our balance is when we feel like we need to be part of the process and the content. And I would say just be comfortable with the fact that whatever process you start off with, invite yourself into a space of unlearning to go, no matter how well prepared I am, no matter what techniques I have, no matter whether I'm using Kanban boards, butcher paper, various exercises, is that for you or is that for the group? Because for me, my approach is my approach. It won't always work for you. My only thing I would like you to invite you to the exploration to say, if your attention is truly on the room, if it's truly on the room, should we even have an agenda before we start? And if we, in our mind, adopt a state of how does this serve the room and what does the agenda mean from this point to the end of the meeting, just know you're enough and you already have the capability to take the group to wherever it needs to. Whatever the agenda is that emerges, be okay with that. Listen to your gut feel rather than listen to the rational mind that's trying to override it.
Thank you. That was a lovely message to the audience and also a summary. So I would take this as the answer to my usual question, how to summarize our conversation to someone who just woke up. If someone in the audience would like to listen more to what you're thinking and saying, or wants to work with you, or read your book, or order your cards, how can they reach you?
The quickest place to start is just visit listeningmyths.com. At listeningmyths.com, you'll be able to download the 5 myths of listening, but more importantly, 5 practical things, not only that you can use to notice these myths, but also how to practice and get a little bit better every day. So at listeningmyths.com, that will create a gateway to our research, which is a research database that's been running for 3 years now, around 1,400 people and their listening barriers in the workplace. It will also open up the opportunity to explore the Apple Award-winning podcast, Deep Listening, where we interview professional workplace listeners as well as personal listeners. That's anybody from an air traffic controller to a Supreme Court judge, to a journalist, to a palliative care nurse or a suicide counsellor. And listeningmyths.com, Myriam, is the best place to go.
Awesome. I will put it in the show notes. Oscar, thank you so much. It was wonderful.
Thanks for giving me a great gift too. Thanks for listening.
Thank you. Thank you for staying tuned and listening to the show. I appreciate your attention as I know how busy you are. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and engage by sharing your comments and thoughts, and visit workshops.work to download the one-page summary. I'm looking forward to seeing you back at the next episode, and I wish you a fruitful day.